All right, the red light means we are live. Welcome to another show of The Bowman Show. Today we're going to go over the brain and its functions. And I think you're going to like who we're going to be interviewing today. Stay tuned, it's going to be a real good one. All right, guys, we're sitting here live with a person that really influenced me to become the teacher I am today. And I'm sure many of you know him already. I'm sure you sit in science class a lot and listen to watch his episodes. And this man really doesn't need much more of an introduction. Please put your hands together for
Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Woo! All right, yep, you got that right. Bill Nye the Science Guy. I know what you're thinking. Why are we learning about science? Why are we learning about the brain? But it's something that we need to know, especially when we're getting into sensation and perception. And what parts of the brain really allows us to do thinking, allows us to smell, feel emotions, hear, okay, how our brain is used to perceive different information or stimulus. So that's why we have Bill on today. So Bill, greetings. How you been, bud?
Hey, Mr. Bowman, really glad to be here with you today. I needed a break from being in the lab, so figured I'd come down and say hi to you guys. And I understand we're talking a little bit about the brain today, so just wanted to step away from all my comedy tours and help you out.
Hey, thanks, Bill. I really appreciate it. Hey, it's awesome you being on the show. The kids really can relate to you. They've seen you growing up. I mean, let's face it, we've seen you. When I was younger, I've seen you, and this is great to have you on the show today. It's really going to press us into the podcast world, having a great on the show.
Well, it's an honor to be here on the Bowman Show.
Hey, well, I appreciate that.
All right, Mr. Bowman, so what are we getting into today?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Bill. We are actually getting into the brain and the functions of the brain. And I just kind of want to talk about first the brain stem, some of the functions it has, some of the how we can relate it to the students. What do you think, the brain stem? What do we got?
Yeah, so our brainstem is kind of in that midbrain area, and it's the relay between our spinal cord and then essentially the rest of our central nervous system. So it takes that information that's coming in from the rest of the body and then relays it to the rest of the parts of the brain throughout the cerebrum, to really specific areas for processing sensory inputs, emotions, pain, all sorts of things like that. And the brainstem in humans is unique because even though many other organisms have a brainstem, ours is particularly highly evolved to allow us to understand the complex experiences that we undergo with our day-to-day lives.
Wow, Bill, I tell you what, I guess that's why you're called a doctor now. That is impressive stuff right there. The brainstem, guys, there you go. This is pretty much relating from the central nervous system, that information we're picking up, and that sensory information, and that is the first processing, right? That's where it's first processed by the brain to either send it to the cerebrum to understand more processes, how to react to these certain stimulus, or maybe just it's useless sensory information. Correct, Bill?
Yeah, so our brains do a really good job at recognizing they have a certain threshold, which will designate a response then by the brain. So, for example, you may get up from your chair and walk to get something from the fridge and step on a thumbtack, and right away you're going to feel that pain input.
Oh, for sure.
Coming,
yeah, you're going to be jumping up in the air, right? You're going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe I stepped on that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And but that same stimulus, so stepping on a thumbtack, may change significantly. Say a bear breaks in through your back door,
Oh.
and you jump up and run away, and you step on the same thumbtack. You're way less likely to even notice that it's there because you've kicked into this fight or flight
Yep.
response, and so right then your body won't even notice that you stepped on.
Okay, so you're going back to relating to, simplistic creatures, that fight or flight. It's like, you know what, this bear just jumped in my house. I gotta either flee or fight this thing. There's no way around it, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and our brainstem plays a big role in kind of activating some of those systems.
Okay, I got you. So stepping on that thumbtack, especially if a bear's in there and he wants to kill you, he wants to rip you apart, he sees he has lunch. You stepping on that thumbtack doesn't really mean anything, right?
Right. It's all about what's the larger threat to you right then.
Okay.
And so if you're just going to get something from your fridge because you're hungry, that thumbtack represents a pretty big threat.
Yeah.
But in comparison to a bear, not so much.
Not so much, right? Yeah, not so much. I think there's a theory on that. I think it's called the gate control theory, correct?
Yeah, really similar idea. Yeah, where we have these different fibers and we perceive certain stimuli over another.
Yeah.
But again, like we talked about, it's very dependent on the context.
Mm-hmm.
And so, our highly evolved brains and our brain stems allow us to recognize context and even relying on our emotions at that time.
Yeah.
To determine what we're feeling and why we're feeling it.
I got you. So other organisms really can't perceive this information like humans can, correct?
No, not that. Some can, but we don't see many that do.
Yeah. So not most, right? It's not most.
Right.
So you're saying humans are more dominant, I guess, and can really process this information more than other organisms, correct?
Well, from what we know so far, yeah. Until we, as we continue to learn, maybe disproven. But
I got
now
you.
we haven't seen any other similar mechanisms.
Yeah, that's some good stuff there, Bill. Bill, the science guy, baby! Woo! Yeah! All right, so the brainstem. We're getting into the parts and the functions. Let's start off with, I don't know, the medulla. The water boy really gets in the medulla, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, we can point to the medulla and say that alligators are ornery just because they got all them teeth but no toothbrush.
They
right?
don't have no toothbrush. And Colonel Sanders isn't up there stating that Mama's wrong, right? Mama's never wrong.
Yeah, she's never wrong. She's never wrong. Except for in this instance where, maybe the medulla is a little bit more complex than just not having a toothbrush. So the medulla is like our autopilot for the body. So it helps control the responses of our autonomic nervous system. So things that we don't really have to think about, like our heart rate, our blood pressure, our breathing, even vomiting, all are partially regulated by cells in that area.
I got you. So this thing, the medulla, is processing this information, and we don't even have to think about doing these tasks, right? It just happens automatically.
Right. This is just always there. Things like our digestion. Like we're not actively sitting here thinking about, I better make sure the food's moving through my intestines. Like
Yeah.
They just do their thing.
I got you.
Our centers in the medulla.
I got you. So eating like a buffalo chicken stromboli down there at JoJo's, you're not sitting there thinking, I got to digest this, and try to get this out of my body. You're not thinking, this is what I got to do. It just happens automatically, right?
Yeah, it's just there. As much as it may want to just get out, you don't really have to pay much attention to it.
You just wish and hope it just comes out, but it just never really does, right? So the medulla, that's like the first start of the brainstem, and then now we're traveling up to the pons, correct?
Yeah. So above that area is the pons, which has a few different parts, and it's kind of almost looks like a bulb on one part of it. But that area, there's a lot of what we have coming out called cranial nerves, and those cranial nerves, many help regulate our kind of vital sensations, some of our special senses. So they help control things like our facial movements, sensation to our face, swallowing, being able to stick your tongue out, things like that. So not just muscle movements, but also our visual processing and things like that. Or our there's a lot going on in that area.
No, I got you. I got you. So like eye movement and everything like that. So again, some information or some processes that we don't actually have to think about and process doing. It just happens automatically, correct?
Yep, yep. Again, this is all kind of just below that conscious level of effort.
Yeah.
These things just occur automatically. For example, in this area, we have our nerve, our vestibulocochlear nerve. So that's our hearing and part of our balance centers as well. So we don't really think about what these areas are doing consciously, but our that information is relayed through this area and then routed to the rest of the brain. So it tells us about where our bodies are in space, or how our head is moving in space. And like we said before, it's really complex information.
Yeah, yeah, very complex. But again, we really don't sit there and focus on performing these tasks. It just kind of happens automatically, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's amazing.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
Autopilot.
Yeah, autopilot. I love autopilot. Thank God Bruce Wayne established that in the Batwing in The Dark Knight Rises, because right, that's what's something
That's what
that's
I'm
needed to be
talking about,
done.
Yeah.
All right, so then we're moving up into the reticular formation. Right, so straight from the pons, we're moving up. These look like the thin rods that are established in the brainstem that are right behind the pons. And what does the reticular formation actually do?
Well, I mean, it's, again, like everything else in our brain, is really complex and handles a lot.
Yeah.
But to really simplify it, it manages our alertness level, or that threshold that we talked about earlier. So, for example, setting your hand down on the desk versus setting it down on the hot stove.
Mm-hmm.
You may feel like you have the same amount of pressure, but it'll let you know, it'll lift that alertness to say, hey, we got to move our hand.
Yeah.
That's basically what that reticular formation does.
Okay, so it keeps our brain awake and alert.
That's right.
Awesome, awesome. So yeah, that's a great reference. Just keeping your hand on a hot stove. Obviously, you're not going to keep it there too long. It's going to process that information, send it to your brain. It's like, yo, remove your hand, or it's going to get burnt. It's going to look ugly. So let's get that going.
Right, and this is what it's like a reflex, basically, where you just don't even, the stimulus is just it happens so quickly, without even really thinking, you pull your hand away.
Awesome. And we just talked about neurons and how that information is sent very, very quick. That neural transmission is sent at a point where we can't even process how fast it goes.
Exactly.
Nice, nice. And then finally, with the brainstem, we're going to finish up with this last function, this last part, which is the thalamus. And real quick, what do you have on the thalamus?
So the thalamus, again, we talked about our brainstem as kind of like the computer chip and relay. Well, the thalamus is sort of that central processor of the computer chip. So it's going to take in all that information and then send it to a corresponding area. So there are different parts of the thalamus, different what we call nuclei, or like collections of cells that relate to certain areas. So there are certain areas for visual inputs, for example, that go then to certain areas of the cortex, so that we can process that information.
Yeah. So the thalamus actually has a very, very difficult task, but again, we really don't think about that. It's something that just happens automatically. And this processing chip sends that information, that neural transmission, to different parts of the cerebral cortex, which we'll talk about and get over here soon. But again, the thalamus, probably one of the most important parts of the brainstem and just of our body, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Interesting stuff there, Bill. All right, there you have it, the brainstem. Very crucial when we're talking about how we're regulating our body processes, stuff that we even don't have to think about. So blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, things like that. The last thing I want to cover with the brainstem is the cerebellum. Bill, what do we have to say about the cerebellum?
So the cerebellum has some similar attributes to the brainstem, and especially in what we were talking about, how it's not necessarily conscious activity. So our cerebellum is sort of like our quality assurance of the brain. So it tells us if we're trying to do a certain movement or a task, how well did we do? What was our performance on that task? And so if I go and I have a lesion of my cerebellum, I might try to pick up a mug, but instead of picking up the mug, I completely overshoot it and I knock it off the desk.
Oh.
Right, and so it relates to our balance, our coordination, and it's one of the first structures in our brain that's impacted by alcohol consumption. And so that's why we see
Oh,
when people consume alcohol, they'll have balance difficulties, speech difficulties, coordination deficits. It's really one of the first areas that suffers from some of those poor choices.
I got you. I'm glad you referenced that as poor choices, especially with alcohol. Once you grab alcohol and throw that in your body, the first thing that's going to impact not only is those thighs, that fatty upper areas of your stomach, but also the cerebellum. All right, your cerebellum is going to face a lot of problems with trying to just relay just certain tasks. Okay, balance, coordination. You'll be stumbling all over the place. You'll be mispronouncing words, and that's something you do not want to do. So I'm glad you brought that up, Nye. Thanks a lot.
No problem, Mr. Bowman.
All right, so then right after cerebellum, I guess we move right into the limbic system. So real quick, limbic system, what's that all about?
Yeah, so our limbic system is again pretty complex. It's sort of kind of like the sort of inner bladder of the brain in a way. It's composed of a lot of different structures. Some that we've already talked about. Some of the other ones include like the hippocampus, the amygdala, hypothalamus, and these areas help regulate emotion, learning, memories, um, everything like that. So it's kind of this deeper level of processing that we have um, from the information that goes to and through the cortex.
Awesome, awesome. So we have the brainstem jutting up into the brain, and then it kind of like branches up like a root. And with the limbic system, that's the inner bladder of the brain. So that kind of wraps around the thalamus, wraps around the brainstem. And with the the hippocampus almost looks like arms that branch off of the thalamus, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. So then the hippocampus, I would say that kind of relates our past and present memories, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Exactly.
Awesome. So with the limbic system, guys, the main thing to really understand is that it is trying to reference our memories and our emotion. And the hippocampus relates our past memories to our present. How we can make judgments off of things that we already performed and kind of relate it to what we're presently presented with, right?
Yep, that's exactly it. I think in a lot of ways we've already talked about this, but our brains are always trying to make sense of what they're encountering,
Yeah.
and that's why things like optical illusions exist, where you perceive something as being one thing, and then maybe one little thing changes and it looks entirely different.
Yeah.
It's because maybe whatever you thought you were seeing at first was kind of relying on this limbic system and these different parts of your memory to make sense of what you were looking at. So we rely on that lived experience to present something to our consciousness that is acceptable or makes sense to us, and it can really throw us off when those two don't mesh well.
I got you. I got you. So when I think about the hippocampus, with sports especially, this is something we can relate it to easily. This is why we train. This is why we go through some of the simulations that we do. Try to prepare ourselves for the next step or the next event that might occur. And with the hippocampus, this relates our past training, our past experiences to what we might face here in the future, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly it. You're relying on those patterns that you've seen before.
Awesome, awesome. And then finally, well, not finally, but the amygdala. All right, the amygdala is something that is attached to the hippocampus. It's like the bulb at the end, correct?
Yep.
It almost looks like a little sphere or a ball. And what do you have to say about the amygdala?
So the amygdala performs again a variety of different tasks, but it processes really complex emotions like anger, fear, sadness, and it helps kind of control or regulate aggression as well.
Oh, okay, okay.
And again, it also relates all that to storing that in the form of memories.
Oh, okay, okay. So the amygdala is processing this information that we have with memories and asserting feelings to those certain memories, right?
Hmm.
I know I was a big fan of Prima Pizza back in the day. Every time I walked in that place, I smelled the aroma. I smelled the different ingredients that Tom Prima was throwing together there. And it was just a memory I always love and cherish. It's like, you know what? My belly's going to be full after this. This memory when the bell rings off that damn door, and when you smell that aroma walking into Prima, and then you hear Tom, "Yo, buddy, how you doing? How you doing?" It's like, "Yeah, hey Tom, how's it going?" That's what I relate the amygdala to. It's like I know every time I hear that bell ringing off the door, every time I smell the aroma walking in that place, I know I'm gonna have a good meal. Correct?
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, that's all what I really remember of Prima Pizza. If you haven't ever experienced Prima Pizza in Valley View, I feel bad for you. I feel bad for you. Bill Nye knows what I'm talking about.
Truly a shame. Truly a shame.
Yep, yep. Yeah, so the amygdala representing fear and pleasure. So yeah, if you're snuggling up with your significant other, the amygdala really relates to those past pleasure memories with each other. That's all I'm going to get into with that. All right, since that got a little awkward, we will now move to the final portion of the limbic system, and I want to talk about the hypothalamus. So, Mr. Bill Nye, what do we have with the hypothalamus?
So the hypothalamus is another one of our regulating centers that one of the big things it does is it helps tell us, are we hungry? Are we satiated? Things like that. It also relates really closely with one of the most important glands in our body, the pituitary gland, and that controls many of the hormones that produce these really, really vital processes for our body, like stress or growth or even reproduction. So the hypothalamus manages all of those things.
Wow, wow. So another very important part of, especially the brainstem looping into the limbic system, and the hypothalamus regulates, when we're thirsty, when we're hungry, and for me especially, that's all the time. That's all the time. Yeah, and I get that. It kind of relates to how emotion and past memories link together. And I know I was just talking about Tom Prima, but how that emotion, how that memory links together. It's like I know exactly when I'm going to be dealt with a perfect meal. Walk into Skianos, you smell that aroma. It's like, well, I know I'm in the right spot. I know exactly what to order here, and it makes sense. It makes sense.
That's you got it, Mr. Bowman.
Awesome, awesome. So now we'll move on to the cerebral cortex, the last portion of the brain I want to get into, and I guess we'll just start off with the lobes of the brain. And with the lobes of the brain, I want to start off with the frontal lobe. Why not? It's right behind the forehead, okay? And what does the frontal lobe do? What kind of processes does that have?
Yeah, so our frontal lobe has, again, now we're talking about the conscious brain. So it's really, really important cognitive skills like expressing our emotions or problem solving, language, judgment. It's kind of like some people compare it to like being the control panel of our personality. And so, if we have issues with the frontal lobe or some kind of, disease or lesion, you can see these drastic changes in personality and people affected.
I got you. I got you. So when you're looking at the cerebral cortex, that's a part of the brain that you familiarize with. The fissures, the spongy-like look it has, and with the frontal lobe, that's plans and judgment, right? That's something that we have to. That's what we need in order to process our daily plans, our schedule, our objectives for the day. Correct?
Yeah, exactly right.
Awesome, awesome. And then I guess we'll move right to the parietal lobe. But before we get to that, right off to the frontal lobe, we have the motor cortex. And the motor cortex, what kind of things does that, what kind of purposes does that have?
And so the motor cortex is part of the area of our brain that helps initiate like purposeful movement. And so there are certain areas of that motor cortex that think of it almost like a map that regulate areas of certain areas of our body. Movements of the arms and limbs versus trunk and things like that.
Oh, I got you. I got you. So again, we're just going to relate it back to sports, since a lot of you students in the class, participate in sports. So when you're performing a task, when you're shooting a basketball, throwing a football, the motor cortex is used in a way to really process those tasks and really perform those tasks. Correct?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome, awesome. And then moving right behind, okay, we had the frontal lobe, moving to the motor cortex, and then finally sensor cortex. The sensory cortex is actually attached to the parietal lobe, the start of the parietal lobe. And what does that sensory cortex do?
So that sensory cortex, again, really it's closely related to the motor cortex. They're really close together. But the parietal lobes help process, again, information coming in from the body that's relayed through the brainstem, for sensations like, for example, heat and temperature from certain areas of the body, pain, or, for example, where our joints are positioned. So something called like proprioception. So knowing that even though you're not looking at where your feet are, you may know that your feet are flat on the floor.
They're there.
Things like that. Yep, they're there.
I got you. So the sensory cortex and motor cortex, especially with sports, again, I like relating to sports. Let's say McLenair is stepping back to pass. He's stepping back. He's going his drop back. He sees an opposing defender coming for him. He throws a quick stiffy out, throws that guy to the ground. He does a spin. He relates himself downfield, and he knows the whole time that his feet are right underneath him the whole time. He knows that looking downfield, and he feels the presence of the defenders around him. He can use his motor cortex to throw that ball down the field to connect for a touchdown, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, like we were talking about, that relies a lot on also that sensory information coming in. So we talk about, like, let's say you go to the museum and you do one of those things where you put your hand in the box and feel like a bunch of spaghetti or something like that. And you're trying to figure out what it is. Well, you have a much harder time realizing what it is if you just put your hand on it and just let it sit there. When you can't feel it and actively use your movements and your motor cortex to get information, you have a much harder time learning about that object. But when we take the best of both systems, where you can feel the difference in texture, difference in pressure, and move your hand around that object, we can much more readily recognize that object.
I got you. So if we had class and everything like that, I do a sensory box, which is items that the students would have inside a box, and the person would come in and try to perceive what's inside that box by feeling it, trying to touch those items, and understand exactly what they're feeling, what they're touching. And that's a cool activity. I wish we could have done it this year, but hey, we're just going to move on, right? We're just going to move on, talk about these the different parts of the brain. And the other part I want to talk about that connects to the sensory cortex is the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, that's right directly on top of the brain, right on top of the head. When you think of the parietal lobe, that's what you're thinking. It's right on top of the head, or on the brain. And what does the parietal lobe do?
Yeah, so that parietal lobe, again, all of these areas are closely related to one another. We talked a little bit more about integrating that. So we're taking the information from our sensory and motor cortexes, so the temporal and frontal lobes, and then integrating that into the parietal lobe. So kind of like you just talked about, that activity is recognizing what that actually is, or what the object is, where it is in space. We're starting to piece together that information in ways that make sense to us.
Okay.
So what basically, to summarize it in a couple words, it's just visual spatial processing.
Okay. Awesome. So with mathematics especially, like if you're in architecture, you're trying to use this parietal lobe to your advantage. You're trying to understand what space we can use with what items and how to try to create something to fit that mold, right?
Yeah. Yep. That's exactly it.
Awesome. All right, and then I guess we'll move right to the temporal lobe. All right, the temporal lobe, right on the side of your brain, right on the side of your head. Okay, obviously the temporal lobe is right beside your temple. Okay, and what does that do? What does the temporal lobe do? What's like the main functions of the temporal lobe?
So there are a lot of different functions. And again, like we talked about with the other lobes, they relate closely, rely a lot on each other.
Yeah.
This is also another area where we process some of the sensory inputs. So the big ones are auditory inputs. So for hearing, this is where our primary auditory cortex is located. And then we also have some visual processing areas as well.
Okay.
Even though, as we'll talk about in a little bit, a lot of the visual inputs are processed in the occipital lobe.
Yes.
this is a really important path for that information to go to the occipital lobe for
Awesome.
vision.
Yeah.
This is also a really big area for language recognition. So, in terms of not only creating meaningful speech, so forming the words and saying them and pronouncing them correctly, but also understanding what somebody is saying to you and processing that language. And that goes not just for speaking, but also written language too.
Okay, okay. So with the temporal lobe, this is processing information. This is processing auditory information. And from what I know, the Broca's area, the Wernicke's area, is located in that temporal lobe. And with the Broca's area, this is something that is introduced with spoken language, right? This is something that we try to perform our spoken language. And the Wernicke's area is how we receive this information. So receive auditory information and process that within our brain. So the temporal lobe has a huge task, especially with communication.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly what we just mentioned earlier. So say there's somebody that has a stroke or an area of the brain that's affected. A lot of times we can see that these two areas impacted, and they get what's called aphasia,
Mm-hmm.
or some sort of language difficulty. Meaning, if Wernicke's area is impacted, it's that they're unable to understand what's being said to them, and Broca's area impacted, and it's unable to actually generate speech.
I got you. I got you. Especially with football players, boxers, they receive a lot of problems, especially to the Broca's temporal area of the brain and aphasia. With the constant contact, with the constant blows to the brain, they receive some of these problems where they might have difficulties receiving information or processing auditory information and even speech, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I got you. I got you. All right, so the last portion of the brain here, Bill Nye, we want to get into the occipital lobe. All right, so the occipital lobe, you mentioned that before when we were talking about the temporal lobe, and I'm glad you talked about how all these lobes work together, how these neural transmissions are sent throughout the cerebral cortex and ties these lobes together. Finally, the occipital lobe, which is located in the back of the brain. Okay, so when you think of the back of your head, the back of your skull, that's where it's located. And what does the occipital lobe do?
Yeah, so the biggest thing is that it's the primary visual area. So there's lots of different parts of the occipital lobe that make up these specific visual areas, but that's their main function. And so there are a few different streams in the occipital lobe when we talk about what we see, that process kind of what it is that we're seeing. But then there's another stream that talks about the where and the how of what we're seeing. All of that information is related to and relayed back and forth with what we talked about in the parietal lobe, in that visual spatial connection.
Awesome.
So, like I said, all these areas are really, really closely tied together. You can't take out one portion of the brain without seeing, huge impact to other areas.
Yeah, yeah, and let's face it. I mean, right now we're at a stage especially with technology, that we can observe which parts of the brain is actually processing certain information that we didn't need to know. But it's very hard to do, right? It's very hard. We're still at the very small steps of understanding the brain and what it can perform and what it can actually do.
Exactly. Yeah. We have really, really advanced technologies. The big one that's used is called fMRI. So
Yeah.
fMRI, or functional MRI. For those of you that don't know, MRI is magnetic resonance imaging. So basically, you're in a machine, and using specific vibrations, we can then view structures layer by layer in our brain, or throughout our body. And what the functional MRI allows us to do is not only see those structures, but we can see in pretty close to real time blood flow. And so when we will look at studies that use this technology, they'll show somebody a certain stimulus, for example, a picture of something.
Yeah.
while they're in the MRI and see what areas light up, what areas get more blood flow during that activity or during that stimulus.
So
that
what's
doesn't
active,
necessarily mean that those areas are 100% active,
Yeah.
but we can at least say with some confidence, that they're getting more blood flow, so they may be providing more input to that task.
Awesome, awesome. We'll get to some of the technology, the scans of how we can observe and see exactly what the brain can actually do in a later lesson. But hey, I'm glad you brought that up, Bill Nye. That was really nice to see that we're going to transition right until studying the brain and how we can actually do these things. And I just want to finish up with the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe again is processing this information that we're visually seeing and just sending it and observing this information, how we can maybe react to it, how we can observe it, right?
Exactly.
Awesome.
And the really cool thing about all this is how quickly it happens.
Yeah.
I mean, the second you look at something, all of these pathways are working together to create your perception. And, you can't think it's just this one area that does this one thing, because they're all interconnected.
I got you. Great, great. Hey, Bill, thanks again for being on the podcast today. It was awesome. I really appreciate it. Is there anything you have to offer to the UDA students right now, especially in these difficult times?
Well, Mr. Bowman, first of all, thank you for having me on the show again. I had a great time coming in and talking with you. The big thing I just want to say to everybody is just be safe. This COVID-19 outbreak is we haven't seen anything like it in our lifetimes. So really take care of yourselves, spend time with your loved ones, and to the graduating seniors, congratulations. I know this is not the way you imagine your graduation going, but now this is just the beginning. You're on to bigger and brighter things.
Hey, Bill, I really appreciate that. I know the UDA students do as well. Thanks a lot for being on the show. Hey, take care.
You take care, Mr. Bowman. Thank you.
All right, say hey hi to the missus for me, okay?
And will do.
All right, guys, there you have it. We talked about the brainstem, the functions of it, and pretty much how it just tries to keep the brain awake and alert and refers that information from the central nervous system to the brain. And then we went over the limbic system, which is the inner bladder of the brain, okay, which obtains many different parts and functions that helps and relates to emotion and memory. And finally, we went to the cerebral cortex, the last portion of the brain, okay, and the lobes of the cerebral cortex, and how that relates and understands our functions, our processes of everyday life. All right, guys, there you have it. Bill Nye the Science Guy crushing it once again with an interview on, you know it, you got it, the greatest podcast in American history, The Bowman Show. All right, see you later. See you next time.